collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
On this week's programme, we have great news about our birds. For the first time in decades, a pair of nesting ravens have been spotted in the Akamas.
Our hope and the evidence, if you like, is that population is doing a little bit better than it was. So it seems that this is a new pair. So this is some of the young of that stronghold that are exploring, because they're great explorers, ravens. They can easily cover great distances.
We hear about a project to save food waste.
To pick up those unsold portions and offer them to people in need.
And ahead of Sunday's elections, we take a look at the political system here in Cyprus.
The parliament does have powers, and perhaps more powers than we sometimes know or the public admits.
For a change, there's great news on the bird front. For the first time in over 16 years, a pair of ravens has been spotted successfully nesting in the Akamas area. Joining us from BirdLife Cyprus is Martin Helikar. Martin, I know you're a great fan of raptors, and I think this is a raptor, isn't it?
Hi, Rosie. Yeah, great news, as you say. It's a corvid. So it is a predator in a sense, but you wouldn't actually put it in the raptor category, though it's bigger and just as impressive as many raptors. It's sort of the giant of the crow family, a very impressive and stately bird. Let me put it like that.
But is it related? The newspaper said it was related to the vulture.
It's not related to the vulture, but it's ecologically related in the sense that they carry out the same role in the ecosystem. So they're both fantastic clearer uppers of the countryside. They both will congregate at the corpses of large dead animals and do a fantastic job of clearing them up. So when you have good populations of both, which sadly we don't at the moment in Cyprus, anything but, then they'll work together. They'll even keep an eye out for each other because they're both quite good at finding dead animals.
Now, we've got just this one pair, I think, in the south, but they have been fairly successful, have they not, in the Bendadaktylos Mountains? So I presume they disappeared, as indeed many of the vultures did, because of poison bait and so on. But is there a timeline on this? Did we always have lots of ravens here before they disappeared?
So if we go back to historical records, they speak of it being a common bird, as it should be from an ecological point of view. I mean, as we already said, it has a key role to carry out. So you need lots of ravens about the place if you're going to have a healthy ecosystem. If we think of a similar island like Crete, not too far west from here, ravens are still quite common there. I mean, they're not as common as the common crow or the magpie because they're much bigger. They're a little bit higher up in the food chain, so you wouldn't expect them to be that common. But, yeah, when we had better habitats, when we had less nasty poison in the countryside, then they were common just as the vulture was reasonably common. And our aim in the long term is to restore that situation.
Now, can you give us an insight into the psyche of this pair? Why would they move, presumably, from Bendadaktylos to Akamas, or have they come from somewhere else?
So the pattern seems to be that, as you said, there's a small number of pairs in the northern range, in the Bendadaktylos range, talking to our allies in conservation, Kuşkor, the Turkish Cypriot Bird Protection Society. They talk of 5 to 6 pairs there, so still a very small number, but clinging on, hanging on, that seems to be their current stronghold there in the north. And our hope and the evidence, if you like, is that that population is doing a little bit better than it was. So it seems that this is a new pair. So this is some of the young of that stronghold that are exploring, because they're great explorers, ravens. They can easily cover great distances, not quite as easily as the vulture can glide around the island, but they can cover great distances. And it looks like the population is experiencing a slight upturn, which is great. And it looks like they've come back to one of their old haunts, which is in the Akamas area.
Interesting you should say that, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but they are notoriously clever birds, are they not, ravens? So could it be that there is, in a sense, an ancestral something that told them this used to be a good place?
Well, all crows are generally the most intelligent of the birds. They can be trained, but they're just really, really smart feathered creatures. So they will lose no time in identifying the best breeding sites. They basically need nice, inaccessible cliffs so that people and other threats such as foxes can't get at their nests. So, when a young raven couple is searching for a new site, they will quite easily find what they're looking for. And because the population is so small, there's currently, a few gaps out there, a few unoccupied cliff ledges that are waiting for the return of the ravens. And let's hope that, this pair, which seems to have raised 2 young ravens, is successful, that these avoid getting poisoned, that our project to reduce poison use and spread the word about the danger of the poison begins to gain some ground, and that they can be then, the parents of more ravens to come, so that down the line we could hope to once more have a good raven population for the health of our countryside, but also because they're just fantastic, characterful birds.
How many eggs do they generally lay? You say they've raised 2. I mean, a lot of these birds that are threatened only manage to raise perhaps 1 young each season, don't they? Because even if they lay 2 eggs, often the weaker of the 2 babies doesn't make it.
Yeah, so 2, I believe, is around what you would expect ravens to produce. You're right, a lot of these larger birds don't reproduce very fast. The vulture is a classic example. One egg a year, and not even every year. They often, need a year to recover before they'll try again. Ravens are not quite as slow as that, but they're certainly, not as prolific as magpies or hooded crows or a lot of the smaller birds. So when you lose these larger creatures a bit higher up in the food chain from the system, it takes a lot longer for them to bounce back, so they need a lot more help. I mean, to give you the wider picture, we've even had discussions with other partners and other organizations, conservation organizations in Europe, about the possibility of bringing ravens from places like Crete, where they're still abundant, to boost our population here. It looks like at the moment, it's too early to say anything is secure, but it looks like at the moment that the ravens are doing it themselves, which is fantastic. And we'll keep a very close eye on this and hope that the direction continues to be an upward one.
There is, of course, a lot of superstition about ravens, isn't there? I mean, one thinks of the Tower of London and the old saying that if the ravens leave, the tower will crumble. What do you make?
It's a positive superstition, isn't it? In the sense that, think of a raven as being useful for the tower or essential for the tower. But there's a lot of negative superstition as well about crows, isn't there?
Yeah, so what do you make of this? I mean, is it good news or bad news for the Akamas?
It's absolutely good news. Of course it is. Of course it is. I mean, if we were wanting to be superstitious, then we'd say, they chose Akamas because the government vision for future Akamas is so terrible that this is an omen. But, I'm a scientist. We're scientific in our approach. But like Cyprus, as you know, so we wouldn't go down that road. But, it is good news in every shape or form. It's, as you said in your introduction, a rare bit of good news in the conservation world, and let's be delighted by that and hope for more to come.
And because they have been missing from our part of the island since the 1980s, a lot of younger people probably won't even know what they are. Are you going to be able to sort of go round the various villages in the area where we know people put down poison and explain the significance of this?
That's a very good point, and I'm glad you raised that, Rosie. I mean, as we've discussed before on your program, we have this 4-year Save the Vulture program, Life with Vultures, funded by the Life Fund, and one of the main actions under that program is to try and limit illegal poison use, the use of poison baits. As part of that, we're doing a lot of contact, discussing with the local communities and other key stakeholders like the hunters. And certainly, now that we know it's back, we will include the raven in that equation. You know, a big part of the fight, if you like, of the battle is to convince people of the importance of these species. And as you say, there is a certain amount of superstition, unjustified, of course, superstition linked to the crow family in general. So yeah, we'll be trying to get across the message about the importance of these species as cleaner uppers of the countryside in order to get local communities on side. I mean, the good news is that on the vulture front, the message is getting across there. So it's not going to be a big leap, I'm hopeful, to convince that this turbo uber crow is also a very important, very recognizable bird that always helps with a lovely deep, deep croak and, you know, outsized, so easy to recognize.
Well,
that is all good. It makes it a bit of a flagship species, doesn't it? You know, easy recognized is always important. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get those positive messages across and gain the support of local communities.
Well, let's certainly hope so. It is brilliant for a change that we have a good news story to talk about in our bird kingdom. Martin Hellicar from BirdLife Cyprus, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much indeed, Rosie.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
You may recall that several weeks ago we talked about food waste. Well, there's a move here in Cyprus to minimise it as much as possible, and the Adlanca municipality has just teamed up with a member of the Department of Psychology and Social Sciences at Frederick University who first started the project going several months ago. He is Stavros Parlalis, and he joins us now. Stavros, welcome. Food waste is very much an issue here in Cyprus, as I mentioned on the previous programme when we discussed this. How have you approached it, and tell us about the cooperation with the municipality?
To be honest, we do know actually the problem of food waste in a European level, but what actually we're missing was an action plan, some first activities in Cyprus. So what we tried to do, to test actually at local level, was to see how people or food industry would actually support some of our initial thoughts. The initial thought, was actually to get those portions that were remaining unsold at the end of the day from food industry like supermarkets who actually sell food, restaurants, coffee shops, etc. So to pick up those unsold portions and offer them to people in need. So that was the initial idea. Akamas municipality and the mayor was actually on our side, and what we managed to succeed for a period of almost 12 months was actually to save almost 15,000 portions of food and offer them to people in need at local level. So that was our aim, and we feel happy that we managed to start a first activity, a first action here in Cyprus.
Right, because Cyprus is pretty high up the European ranks when it comes to food waste, I think. But I would imagine that this is quite a logistical nightmare. You're talking about food that has already been cooked, am I correct? So somebody has to go round all these places at the end of the day and collect it all.
That's right. In the first place, you are right. Cyprus is actually one of the 3 or 4 countries across the European Union on food waste, so this is a big issue, even if we don't consider it like this here in Cyprus. Coming to your second statement, we did have 2 persons who actually did what you have just described, going around to those very specific places, food industry companies, collect food and deliver it to very specific houses, people in need. So this is how we run the project, our idea, and actually come to an outcome as I described earlier.
But I understand that there are needy families who don't want to be identified. So how do you get over that? Because they don't want to have themselves on your list in case other people find out that they are indeed in need.
You're right. So we did have some colleagues, social workers, who actually did some interviews with those families. We were going to their places after the remission, so we have a list. Any family, even if individuals, can actually join our list according to their needs and according to the description of their needs they provide us. So we don't function like a public department. We do realize people's needs, and according to their willingness, we try to support them as far as we can. We don't offer food to people that they don't like to be involved in our list in the project at all. We do visit people that they are willing to accept food provided by the project.
In some other countries, little sort of mini restaurants have sprung up where this food is taken and then whoever wants can go there and eat. Is that a possibility here in Cyprus? Possibly not in a high-profile place, but in areas where you know there are quite a lot of needy people.
I think this is a really nice idea, and this has to do with the owners, the businessmen, and according to their understanding of food waste or understanding that they have to give back to the society, to the community, some of their earnings or of how they could actually support people in need in local level. So it's a social responsibility, corporate social responsibility of businesses, even the small one. So I think there is great room for a development at this level, but it's up to individuals in first place, and then we have to inform society, to inform people, youngsters, or even business owners, as just described, how they could act, how they could actually act in an environmental friendly manner rather than closing their business at the end of the day and throw away what they have left, and that's it. So there is room for improvement, but people have to be aware of the problem, the causes or the consequences when they actually throw away some portions of food.
Okay, but if you set up a little restaurant, you would need volunteers to run it, and I'm presuming it is volunteers who at the moment go around the restaurants that are in this project collecting their food. So what I'm wondering is if you could sort of put the two together.
Well, this is an ideal example of what could happen, but at the end of the day, there should be someone who actually manages all this project, runs it, and be responsible to run it smoothly in a longer period. So it's not something that's not achievable, but someone has to take the role of
coordinator
and run it as smooth as possible, meaning in a daily basis or at least during the weekdays.
Can I ask you what the Arlanjan municipality is actually contributing to this project? Are they giving you manpower, vehicles, what?
Actually, Arlanjan municipality supported us in two different meanings. In first place, they actually persuaded or actually supported our aim, and we achieved to have access to bigger companies, businesses, and even smaller local companies. So it's a kind of, let's say, prestigious picture of municipality, of the mayor, and actually gives credibility to the project. So it's not actually Dr. Stavros Paralis who runs the project. It's the Frederick University, Frederick Research Center, and the local municipality, who both of them actually run the project in first place. In second place, Aglatia municipality actually runs the project, actually funds the project. So Aglatia municipality currently runs the project at least till the end of the year.
Can you tell me finally about the app that I think Frederick University is trying to develop that would measure food waste? How would that feed into this whole concept?
We did have an app during a Save Our Food project, which actually connected donations to service users. And this is actually something designed and run throughout the Save Our Food project. What you are mentioning is a totally different app. I'm not sure how you know all this information, but this is a new concept which I'm not sure if I could share more information about it right now.
All right, you're going to keep it as a surprise when it's up and running, I guess. Thank you very much indeed for trying to help us save food. It's a dreadful waste when it goes into landfill. Stavros Paralis, thanks for joining me.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
And he is with the Frederick University Department of Psychology and Social Sciences. Just get your head around this. A person in Cyprus throws away 372 kilograms of food per year. It's a crime.
You can subscribe to the Cyprus News Digest on iTunes for free and get the program downloaded to your phone or tablet so you can listen anytime, anywhere.
Well, Sunday, of course, sees parliamentary elections here in Cyprus, and it's rather different this year than it's been for many, many years, with over 600 people vying for just 56 seats. Now, the system in Cyprus is rather different to those in other European countries. To unravel what the differences are, we welcome to this week's programme Lecturer of Comparative Politics at the University of Cyprus, Michalis Moutzelos. Michalis, we have a president and we have a parliament, but they don't have the same sort of roles that they do in many other countries, do they? So can you explain how the executive and the legislature works? Because people are only voting on Sunday for the parliament.
That's correct. One interesting bit there is that the parliamentary elections do not take place at the same or roughly at similar times as the presidential elections, as they do, for instance, in France. And so that means that the president faces this kind of election every time in the middle of his or her term. So that's one interesting bit. And then you can say that Cyprus is a presidential system whereby the president has most of the powers to appoint government ministers and fire them, actually. And the ministers have sort of right of initiative to propose legislation, and then the parliament votes on this legislation. Now, the government, appointed by the president, are the ones, for instance, who have the exclusive right to propose the budget, and that's very important, and that's different from other parliaments around the world. But it is also true that the parliament in Cyprus can also propose legislation on its own without the approval of the government. For instance, that was the case recently with a piece of legislation that the opposition parties proposed on the issue of foreclosures, of house foreclosures. So, long story short, the president is much more powerful than the parliament, and this is also reflected in how contested presidential elections are compared to parliamentary elections. But that said, the parliament does have powers, and perhaps more power than we sometimes know or the public admit.
Well, I don't know, you talk about the foreclosures, but I thought that that was Parliament putting amendments to a government-proposed legislation. So you're saying that MPs can actually draw up completely new legislation and vote on it?
Yeah, that was not an amendment. That was a new piece of legislation that a sort of a coalition of opposition parties proposed, and they could file this legislation. They can file any piece of legislation aside from the budget. So they can do that constitutionally. The problem is that they face obstacles to find the majority to pass the legislation. Why? Because there is usually a majority that comes from the president's party, not always, but often. And then the president has weapons. He can sort of send it back instead of ratifying it. He can refer it to the Supreme Court. He can do all sorts of things to make it difficult for Parliament to actually pass a piece of legislation on its own. But actually, no, that piece of legislation was something initiated by Parliament itself. So that's why I'm saying sometimes we don't know that Parliament actually has more power than we think. Yeah, not just power of amendment, but actually the power of proposing legislation in Cyprus. Again, budget is the big exception, and it's a big one. Yeah.
Right, now then you talk about the presidential party usually being in the majority, and certainly over the years, I mean the party system here in Cyprus is very well embedded, and there are probably, 3 major parties, and there have usually been 3 or 4 smaller parties possibly gaining 1 seat. But as I said at the beginning, with so many groupings now of individuals, 600 plus people trying to get those 56 seats, if the whole look of Parliament changes and we end up with the big parties who've been coming under a lot of flack, particularly with the corruption scandals, if they lose a lot of seats and we end up with maybe a dozen of the seats going to these individuals who are part of groupings but they've only just managed to make the 3.6%, what difference do you think that will make to the ability of Parliament to actually pass legislation? There'll be a lot of horse trading surely going on in the run-up to the presidential elections, which strangely always happen halfway through the parliamentary term. Like you said, that the parliamentary ones happen halfway through the presidential term. It's a bit of a mix-up, isn't it?
Yeah. As you said, the horse trading that takes place before the presidential elections means that there is a majoritarian tendency that sort of, in a sense, corrects, the proportional aspects of the system. What I mean by that is that, usually there is a lot of parties at the Cypriot Parliament, but then they are forced to form majoritarian coalitions to elect the president, as we know. But you're right. If we have even more of those parties, for instance, if we have, the Greens, that splinter party from Vico, and if we also have, the independent list, I think it's called Generation Change now, if they all make it, then, it will be difficult to pass legislation, and you might end up with deadlocks and showdowns like the one we had with the latest budget vote. That is true.
On the other hand, I suppose people could say that we desperately need different voices in Parliament to act as checks and balances on the government legislation.
Indeed, that is correct. The Cypriot political system, the party system, has been described in the sort of political science literature as consensual. And what political scientists mean by that is that they do these kinds of deals. They end up voting with other parties on legislation that has been proposed by government ministers. And so there is a sense that the system is consensual, but in a consensual system, it is also not clear how, as you said, more innovative, perhaps you could say even more radical voices from civil society, how they could make an impact. And then that's something that new parties could bring to the table. with the usual caveat, then that they will have to somehow work with the president-appointed government. So, yes, it's a bit of a give and take.
Bit of a give and take. We'll see how much of one it's going to be when the results come out on Sunday. Michalis Moutselos, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.